Hotel family. This your brother Matthew Daniels, aka M Pooh, aka the Chosen Few, and y'all see the title of this one. Today we're gonna be talking about in this video white slaves in America, the hidden history. I was reading in a book by a man named Booker T. Washington, and he's actually one of my favorite authors, historians, orators, and scribes, African American. He was actually born in 1856. He was born a slave before the Civil War. He was born enslaved, and he died November 14th, 1915. And he wrote several works, one of which being The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. And I've read this book before, quite a few months back, maybe even a year ago, to be honest. And while reading this book, he opened my eyes up to a lot, right? He put a extensive amount of history about the African American prior to slavery, during our enslavement, and shortly thereafter. And he compiled for us an enormous amount of information that a history buff such as myself can actually go back to, dig into, and learn a lot. And so there was certain things that he said about white slaves in America that stood out to me when I originally read the book. And sometimes when I read stuff and I learn new information, I have a habit of assuming in my mind that other individuals know the information that I know. It's a funny thing. Once it's in my head, once it's in my mind, I erroneously assume that is common knowledge, and I don't really consider that the majority of people may not know the information that I know, or may not have as much information on a topic that I have. And so sometimes I don't share everything that I'm aware of because I'm assuming that people already know. So what I ended up doing, right? I made a Facebook post on my Facebook page, Matthew Daniels, and in a group that I run on Facebook called The Real Bookworm. You can see the correct spellings in the description box. Uh, I made a post about something that Booker T. Washington said about white slaves in America. And the response I got from that particular post led me to believe that good, it would be a good thing if I were to actually present this information in video format so I could be able to explain some of the key points and actually show the people what it is that Booker T. Washington said in his book. As you all know, on Facebook, when you're making a post, you really don't want to make the post too long, so you really can't quote several pages of a particular work, of a particular book. You just want to hit the high note, hit the main point, and maybe post a picture associated with it, and keep it moving. So what I'm going to be talking about is white slaves in America, the hidden history, and I'm going to be using as my ultimate primary source, the works of Booker T. Washington, The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. Now, I do have other primary documentation to prove or to back up what I'm saying, because some people right now may be thinking that what white slaves in America, no, there aren't any white slaves in America. So I want to ask you something. When someone says slavery, or someone says chattel slavery, or someone says slavery in America, what do you think about? right? What do you think about? 9 times out of 10, because of how we've been conditioned psychologically, these are the types of images that comes to mind when one says slavery. Okay, the African American has been so closely associated with the concept of slavery that whenever someone mentions a slave or mentions slavery, these types of images pops up in our mind. Never mind the fact that there were white slaves in America as well, that I'm about to prove here shortly. Never mind the fact that there were white people enslaved in the European countries before there was Africans enslaved in America. Never mind the fact that you can find forms of slavery in virtually every ancient society that we have record of, that we have recordation of. You have slavery going back to the ancient Egyptian Empire. You have slavery going back to the ancient Sumerian Empire. You have slavery with the Greeks. You have slavery with the Spartans. You have slavery with the Romans. Okay, you have slavery with the Hebrews, the Israelites. You have slavery in Mesoamerican cultures, with the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas. You have slavery, okay, on the African continent. In the Congo, you had slavery. In Mali, you had slavery. Okay, in Ethiopia, in Nubia, in all of these places, you had slavery. In Carthagena and Carthage, you had slavery. So slavery has been inflicted upon all people on the planet in all different time periods on the planet. But in our particular day and age, the African American has been so closely associated with slavery that even when you have the discussion about slavery, images like this pop up in your mind. So I'm going to show you another image, and I'm going to ask yourself, family, why is it that when people say slavery, you don't picture this? Okay? Have you ever seen images like this before? And if you haven't, you have to ask yourself, why? Why haven't you seen images like this? Okay? Even if someone says slaves picking cotton, if someone says slaves picking cotton, you will automatically imagine images like this. Why? Because these are the images that you have been shown, and the story that you have been told fits these images. But if you were to be told the truth, and if you were to be shown actual images of white slaves in America, then psychologically it would change your entire perspective when you think about said subject matter. And look at this. Let's just take some time out. This is a cotton field, barefooted, picking cotton, white people. Okay, think about that. I want you to let this image soak into your subconscious, not so you can view all white people as slaves. That's not my intent. My intent is to break that psychological chain around your mind that makes you automatically associate the African American with slavery. And I want you to open your mind up to the historical reality that slavery has been inflicted upon every ethnicity on the planet at some point in time, even right here in America, where the by far the majority incidents of slavery we know about is black people. You know, take a look at this image. All right, we just want to look at some images for a second before I get into the documentation. This is a fairly common image, whereas you may not have seen this image before. I'm quite sure you've seen images like it. in movies, in books, in Facebook posts, whether it's for or against it. You've seen something like this before. Look at that. The black lady, the African American female on the auction block being sold. Off to the right, the African American male either just being sold and putting his clothes back on or about to get up there on the auction block to be sold. But you see the slave auction and you see the African American at the slave auction. And psychologically, your mind associates African American with slave and European with slave master. But what if I was to show you an image like this, family? What about this? Instead of an African American woman, you see a European woman, a Caucasian woman, right? Slave. And in the background, you see a few more being presented to someone who may or may not purchase her. European slave woman, African American slave woman, African American slave woman, European slave woman. I'm pretty sure some of these images you have never seen. But like this, I'm pretty sure some of these images you have seen. We all know the image of Africans being rounded up, tied, hands bound, right? Sticks tied around their necks. And these images have been burned into our minds. So much so, and I'm going to say it again so you understand the purpose of the video, so much so that we automatically associate the African and the African American with slavery as if we were designed to be slaves. We were born to be slaves. And we are the only race of people who have ever been subjected to slavery. And that's not true. But images shape our perception of reality. And if this is the only image you've ever seen, then I can't blame you for automatically associating images like this when you hear the word slavery. Language is all about word and image association. You associate images with the words you hear and you make sense of the words to get context on what the speaker is saying to you, right? So these are the images that we're aware of. These are the images that we aren't aware of. The landing of the convicts. You have convicts, right? I want you to know something. Some of the slaves that were in America, some of the white slaves that were in America were shipped to America from European nations. Europeans were enslaving other Europeans. And when the colonies were being founded on these shores, a lot of those prisoners, slaves, indentured servants, convicts were shipped to the Americas to work as slaves, indentured servants over here. And you see the same type of imagery that you may not be used to seeing, but you see the same type of imagery with them being marched, chained up, and bound one to another. But again, this is what you're used to seeing. And it's, oh, yes, a slave. And even now, you may be telling yourself that those aren't slaves. They say it's convict, chosen few. That's not a slave. But if you just hold your horses, bear with me, I'm going to prove my point. Anyone who watches my videos know that I'm going to prove my point. Just bear with me, okay? What about this? Images like this, again, we're familiar with babies and all, rounding up black babies, African babies, taking them off to be sold into slavery, to be beat, to be hung, to be lynched, to be worked to death, right? To be used as chattel. These are the images that we are familiar with. So yes, we know that there were African slaves, but were there white slaves? Has the white man ever been a slave? Were there white slaves in America? We talking about that hidden history. Take a look at this, family. What do you see there? Children and adults, chains around their necks, chains around their hands, being led to the auction block. White people enslaved in European countries and in America. Now, mind you, the first place a person is going to go is they're going to say that, well, in America, the white man wasn't a slave, he was an indentured servant. And the black man, he was a slave. The African American, he was the slave. The white man, he was an indentured servant. And on the surface, they will have a point. There was a time, an extended period of time, when the African American was the sole burden bearer in this nation, and he endured atrocities that only he and she was enduring. Okay, and there is a such thing as indentured servitude, and there is a such thing as slavery, and the two are at their core different, right? So this is the first place that someone is going to go. They're going to say that the white man was not a slave, the white man was an indentured servant, and the black man, he was a slave. And I'll admit that that is a pretty good point. So that point must be dealt with. But I maintain the white man was just as much a slave right here in America as the black man was. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at those two definitions. We're going to look at indentured servant, indentured servitude, and we're going to look at slavery so that you can get a better understanding of what these terms actually mean. And then we're going to look at them in the historical context, and we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to figure out if white people were actually slaves in America. I've already probably shocked you with some of the images that I've shown you. So as I give you these definitions, we're going to get to some of the documentation. Okay? So an indentured servant on the left, families. An indentured servant or indentured laborer is an employee indenturee within a system of unfree labor who is bound by a signed or forced contract to work for a particular employer for a fixed time. The contract often lets the employer sell the labor of an indenturee to a third party. Indenturees usually enter into an indenture for a specific payment or other benefit or to meet a legal obligation such as debt bondage. On completion of the contract, indentured servants were given their freedom and occasionally plots of land. In many countries, systems of indentured labor have now been outlawed and are banned by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a form of slavery. So they've already told you that indentured servitude is a form of slavery. They've already admitted that. But one of the fundamental differences is a lot of the indentured servants, they went into the classification as an indentured servant by contract. And they were to be an indentured servant for someone for a specific amount of time, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 7 years, 3 years. It was a specific amount of time that they were supposed to be an indentured servant, that they were supposed to be the servant to whoever had possession of the contract. And at the end of the contract, at the end of their term, they received their freedom, and whatever stipulations the contract said that they were supposed to receive at the end of their contractual obligations as an indentured servant, they received it. Okay, and before I read the slave, what a slave is, I want to point out that people are so quick to say that, oh, it was slavery going on in Africa already, and the African sold the African to be enslaved to the European in the first place. Now, what I want you to think about, family, is while on the African continent they may not have called it indentured servant or indentured servitude, but the form of slavery there as well. It was something similar to being indentured servant. It wasn't the chattel slavery that became of slavery in the Americas. Okay. So let's look over to the right side and let's read what slavery is. Slavery is any system in which principles of property law are applied to people, allowing individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals as a de jure form of property. A slave is unable to withdraw unilaterally from such an agreement and works without remuneration. Many scholars now use the term chattel slavery to refer to this specific sense of legalized de jure slavery. In a broader sense, however, the word slavery may also refer to any situation in which an individual is de facto forced to work against their own will. Scholars also use the more generic terms such as unfree labor or forced labor to refer to such situations. However, and especially under slavery in broader senses of the word, slaves may have some rights and protections according to laws or customs. So this is the separation that they're going to try to make between white people and black people in America. They want to say once you find out that white people were slaves in America, they're okay, you expose that, but the white people were indentured servants, the black people were slaves. It was nothing alike. But we're going to bust up that myth. But before we bust up that myth, I want to go into the indentured servant and this whole contract. What does these contracts look like? And is there any proof of this? So now we're going to dig off into some of the documentation and we're going to bring this thing together. Okay, now this particular piece of information, this particular document is from the year 1742. Now, while I can't read it all because it's an old, it's an old contract and some of the handwriting I can't read. I'm going to read whatever I can read, but what we can see is enough to understand what's going on. It says, this indentured witnesses that, and it says the name, hath put himself, and by these presents doth voluntarily and of his own free will and accord put himself an apprentice to Robert Livingston, maybe, of New York, with him to live, and after the manner of an apprentice to serve from the first day of November, Anno Domini, 1742. Anno Domini, whenever you see people put a year and they put AD, AD is the shortened form of Anno Domini, and they're basically saying that the year of our Lord. These people were Christians. So they're saying the year 1742, 1742, till the full term of 5 years be complete and ended. So this individual was signing a contract to be an indentured servant for the time of 5 years. Okay. During all which term the said apprentice, his said master, faithfully shall serve, his secrets keep, his lawful commands gladly everywhere obey. He shall do no damage to his said master, nor fee to be done, and it kind of cuts off. So what we see here is an example of the contract that indentured servants would sign with the person who is to be their master. So you see, it says who the indentured servant is. It says who the master is going to be, when this contract began, and how long this contract is going to be. Now, if we saw the whole contract, the entire contract, it would also tell us what this indentured servant was entitled to at the end of his service. Okay, so I just wanted to show one more example. This is going to lead into what we're talking about. This is another example of a contract that's in the year 1766, from what it looks like, and it says this indenture made the either 19th or 17th day of August, maybe, in the year of our Lord, 1700 1866 between Patrick somebody of the one party and Thomas Blood, looks like, of the other party. Witnesses that the said somebody being ordered to be transported pursuant to the statute doth hereby covenant, promise, and grant to and with the said somebody blood, his executors, administrators, and assigns from the day of the date hereof until the first and next arrival at America, and after, for and during the term of, looks like, 7 years, to serve in such service and employment as the said, the name of the master, or his assigns shall there employ him, according to the custom of that country in the like kind, in consideration whereof the said master doth hereby covenant and grant to and with the said servant to pay for his passage and to find and allow meat, drink, apparel, and lodging with other necessaries during the said term, and at the end of said term to pay unto him the usual allowance according to the custom of the country in the like kind, in witness whereof the parties above mentioned to these indentures, having interchangeably set their hands and seals the day and year first above written, signed, sealed, and delivered in the presence of somebody, I, Taylor, Lord Mayor of the city of Dublin. Okay, so here we see an indentured servant signing contract with his master to be an indentured servant for 7 years. But we see something real interesting here. You see that he is being sent to America from the city of Dublin. So you have indentured servants coming from the city of Dublin, right? And the city of Dublin is in Ireland, okay? The city of Dublin is in Ireland. So you have an Irish guy being sent from Ireland, Dublin, Ireland, to America as an indentured servant. So you have a white person, a white European from Ireland coming to America as an indentured servant, as the possession of someone else. Now I want you to take a look at the top left hand of this contract, and you see that you see those like three castles within the border, right? You see those three castles within the border. Look at that flag. This is the flag of Dublin. So you see that that's an official document from Dublin, and I just posted a map to show you where Dublin is. Dublin is in Ireland. So this was an Irish guy, right? This was an Irish guy being sent to America. So not only did I show you the pictures, right? Not only did I show you the pictures, not only did I explain to you what an indentured servant is and what a slave is, not only did I show you actual contracts of indentured servants and how it's set up, I just showed you also an actual factual indentured servant coming from Ireland, an Irish man coming from Ireland to be an indentured servant in America. That's what they're showing you right here. Okay. Now, still, don't jump out there and say was still few that's just an indentured servant. The Africans, they came over as slaves. Because don't jump out the window just yet, because I'm going to prove my point. I'm going to show you that these Irish people who was quote unquote indentured servants did not have it any better than the African. Don't be fooled by the terminology. Okay, don't be fooled by the terminology. All right. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm going to go into the actual text of the late great ancestor, the historian, the orator, the scribe, Booker T. Washington, in his book, The Story of the Negro. And you're going to see that actually, family, there was a lot of Irish slaves in America. Okay, and I'm gonna prove it, right? I'm gonna prove it. This is page 63 of the story of the Negro by Booker T. Washington. He says, during a recent visit to Baltimore, Maryland, chance threw in my way a facsimile copy of an old Baltimore newspaper, the Maryland Journal, the first number of which was published August 20th, 1773. This paper contained one or two items of news and several advertisements that were peculiarly interesting to me. One of these advertisements which attracted my attention was about as follows: £10 reward. Ran away on the 6th of July last from the subscriber, living in Barnes Forest within 8 miles of Joppa in Baltimore County, an Irish servant man named Owen McCarty, about 45 years old, 5 feet 8 inches high, of a swarthy complexion, has long black hair which is growing a little gray, and remarkable scar under the right eye. He had on and took with him when he went away a short brown coat made of country manufactured cloth, lined with red flannel with metal buttons, honors of Briggs trousers patched on both knees, a white shirt, an old pair of shoes, and an old felt hat. Now, wait a minute, pause right there. Normally, the only thing that they ever show you, family, is Negro runaway slaves, African runaway slaves, Black people runaway slaves. Here you have an Irishman named Owen McCarthy with a £10 reward on his head because he ran away from his master. Now tell me something. If being an indentured servant was so much better than being a slave, and he only had to do it for a certain amount of time, and at the end of his contract, he was supposed to get whatever the contract said that he was supposed to get. What is this man doing running away? Why is he a runaway slave just like the Negro runaway slaves that we see? And how come we always see and hear about the runaway Negro slave, but nobody ever told you that it was articles in those same newspapers talking about Irish slaves running away, white people, slaves running away from the slave master. And not only that, the white people putting a reward on their head, like bring him back, bring him back. Look at that. Ran away on the 6th of July last from the subscriber, living in Barnes Forest within 8 miles of Joppa in Baltimore County, an Irish servant man named Owen McCarty. Right? That's crazy. That's crazy. You ain't never seen that before. You ain't never seen that before, but I just showed you it was already Irish people being sent from Ireland to over here. And what was happening was they was assuming that everything would be hunky dory with those contracts. But you know how it go when you when they were getting to the Americas, and once they were already the property and the belongings of the master of these white slaves, then they were being treated just as bad as the Africans was being treated. And they were realizing things weren't sweet. Some of them weren't being let go on time. Some of them were being beat. Some of them were being lynched. Some of them were being hung. Some of them were being killed. And so you will see time and time and time again that they were running away, just like the African slave. It was no different, right? On page 64, Booker T. Washington states, until a short time ago, the condition of bondage had always been associated in my mind, as in the minds of most colored people in this country, with a black skin. I had heard, as most schoolboys have heard, that centuries ago there had been white slaves in England, and that in other parts of Europe, slavery and serfdom had lasted to a much later period than in England. I remember reading somewhere the story of Pope Gregory, who, seeing some beautiful English slaves exposed for sale in the Forum at Rome, was so impressed by their sad condition that he determined to undertake the conversion of Britain. These events, however, all belong to a remote past. I never had the least idea until I began to investigate the subject that any human being except the Indian and the Negro had ever been bought and sold and in other respects treated as property in America. The fact is, however, that although Negro slaves were brought to Jamestown only 12 years after the first settlement there, the system of white servitude had preceded black slavery in both the Plymouth and Virginia colony. Most of the work on the plantations and elsewhere was performed at first by white servants who were imported from England and sold like other merchandise in the markets of the colony. Did you hear that? The man said white servitude preceded black slavery. Before the first Negro slaves reached Jamestown, Virginia, there was already white people enslaved there, right? There was already white slaves being imported from England before they were scooped up from Africa. So why is it that whenever someone talks about slaves and slavery in America, why is it we only see the African American? Why is it? When the white man and the white woman was enslaved in America too. Maybe it's because someone doesn't want to show them in that particular light. Maybe. He goes on to say the historian Bancroft says of this matter, conditional servitude under indentures or covenants had from the first existed in Virginia. The servant stood to his master in the relation of a debtor, bound to discharge the cost of immigration by the entire employment of his powers for the benefit of his creditors. Oppression early ensued. Men who had been transported into Virginia at the expense of 8 or 10 pounds were sometimes sold for 40, 50, or even threescore pounds. The supply of white servants became a regular business, and a class of men, nicknamed spirits, used to delude young persons, servants, and idlers into embarking for America as to a land of spontaneous plenty. White servants came to be an article of traffic. They were sold in England to be transported, and in Virginia was sold to the highest bidder, like Negroes. They were to be purchased on shipboard as men buy horses at a fair. In 1672, the average price in colonies where 5 years of service were due was 10 pounds, while a Negro was worth 20 or 25 pounds. It has also been said that the almshouses and the prisons were emptied to furnish laborers for the colonies of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. You hear what he's telling us? He's telling us that they cleaned out the almshouses and the prisoners, and they sent them all overseas to the colonies in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, and enslaved those white people right here in what we know to be America. He says that they were sold to the highest bidder, just like the Negroes, right? Just like the Negroes, okay? White slavery in America, white slaves in America, fact or fiction. But it was not, he goes on to say, the scholar, but it was not merely the destitute and the outcast that was sold into servitude in the English colonies in America. Many of these persons were political prisoners and persons of quality. So not only were the prisoners sent from European countries To the English colonies in America to be enslaved, it was also political prisoners and persons of quality, like high-born people shipped off. You had individual factions fighting amongst each other in European nations. And what they would do is people would round up their enemies and send them off to be enslaved in the Americas. But they paint the picture of the African selling African, talking about one African nation or one African tribe will go to war with another African nation or another African tribe, and then they would sell those prisoners of war. And they make it seem like that this is a purely African phenomenon, as if the European was not at the same exact time doing the same exact thing in Europe. Why is it that we know about Africans selling Africans, but not Europeans selling Europeans? Why is it that we know about Africans taking prisoners of war and political prisoners and noble people in the highborn of their enemies being sold off as slaves, but we don't know about the Europeans doing the same thing to their own people? Why don't you know this? Why do you not know this? So the usual, according to the same historian, was this manner of dealing in Englishmen that not the Scots only, who were taken in the field of Dunbar, were sent into involuntary servitude in New England, but the royalist prisoners of the Battle of Worcester, the leaders in the insurrection of Penruddock, were shipped to America. They say that, man, it was so common that it wasn't just Englishmen and Scots, right? It wasn't just them. It was in more than one European nation that was shipping people off to be enslaved, and it was more than one European stock of individual that was being enslaved right here, and it was being shipped off right here to America, and they were being enslaved right over there in Europe. So while you had Africans enslaving Africans on the African continent, you had Europeans enslaving Europeans on the European continent. And while you had Africans selling Africans to be enslaved over here in America, you had Europeans selling Europeans to be enslaved over here in America. These are just the facts. At other times, large numbers of Irishmen were sold into servitude in different parts of America because the number of slaves brought to America was so immense. The sufferings which they underwent has made a profound impression upon the world. But from all that I have been able to learn, the sufferings endured by these unfortunate Irish bondservants during the course of the long voyages to America were frequently as hard as those of the slaves. The crowded exploitation of Irish Catholics, Bancroft remarks, was a frequent event and was attended by aggravations hardly inferior to the usual atrocities of the African slave trade. So you have large numbers of Irishmen being sold into servitude in different parts of America. And not only were they treated bad as slaves in America, they were even treated bad on the ship. They had their own middle passage. Right? So tell me, where's the difference? You want to play word games with indentured servants and slavery? Wait a minute. Europeans were enslaving Europeans, Africans were enslaving Africans, Europeans were selling Europeans, Africans were selling Africans. They suffered atrocities on the ship. Europeans, white people, black people, Africans suffered atrocities on the ship. They suffered cruelties when they got here as slaves. They suffered cruelties when they got here as slaves, right? My boy say, Booker T, I'm glad the ancestors documented this last paragraph. In 1685, when nearly 1,000 prisoners were condemned to transportation for taking part in the insurrection of Monmouth, men of influence at court scrambled for the convicted insurgents as a merchantable commodity. So Monmouth, that's like in Britain, right? So apparently in 1685, this 1685 is only slavery only popping. There was an insurrection over there. And so nearly 1,000 people were condemned to be transported off to be held enslaved, right? And so, men eventually flooded the court. High-born people was like, hey, I want in on this. Give me this person, give me this person, give me this person to sell. And they sold their own people to be enslaved in America, right? Bond servitude, as it existed in the English colonies, was in many respects peculiar and unlike any form of servitude which had existed among. Wait a minute, I may have. No. Bond servitude, as it existed in the English colonies, was in many respects peculiar and unlike any form of servitude which had existed among English people. The first bond servants were sent out by the London Company, the company by which the Virginia colony was founded. It was not intended that servants should be transferred from one master to another, but the depressed condition of agriculture following the massacre of 1622, according to James Bala, compelled planters to sell their servants and thereafter made the sale of servants a very common practice among both officers and planters. For instance, in 1623, George Sandys, the treasurer of Virginia, was forced to sell the only remaining servants of the company, the 7 men on his plantation, for 150 pounds of tobacco. Gradually, says Mr. Bala, that legal personality of the servant was lost sight of in the disposition to regard him as a chattel and a part of the personal estate of the master, which might be treated and disposed of very much in the same way as the rest of the estate. Now they're referring to these quote unquote indentured servants as chattel. He became thus rated in inventories as a state and was disposed of both by will and deed along with the rest of the property. So now, just like the African, they're listed as property and inventories of the estate. And when the individual that had these so-called indentured servants, they were willing them to to their descendants or whoever they wanted to will them to, in their will. The same exact thing that was happening to the African slave. But when you talk about the Africans, you want to say slave. When you talk about the white people, you want to say indentured servant, muddy in the waters. No, white people were slaves in America, plain and simple. At the same time, there grew up a systematic speculation in servants, both in England and in Virginia. A servant could be transported to America for from 6 to 8 pounds and sold for from 40 to 60 pounds. London and Bristol were the chief markets for young men and women who were sold to ship owners who transported them to America and sold them. Now, watch this. The number of servants imported who were obtained in this and other ways was from 1650 to 1675, when the trade began to decline considerable. The number of such white servants imported into Virginia alone from 1664 amounted to 1,500 a year. And it is said that the number sent from England to the colonies and the West Indies amounted to 15,000 a year. It was surprising to me to learn that a little more than 200 years ago, Englishmen sold the prisoners taken in their civil wars in much the same way that the African people captured and sold people of their own race. But the knowledge of these facts has helped me to understand that when Negro slavery began in this country, the condition of the African slaves was not so exceptional as it afterward became and as it now seems. So what he's saying is, yes, over time, the enslavement of whites stopped, and the African was forced to take the full brunt of what we know to be slavery, and his conditions were very, 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 very bad and very, 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 very harsh. No one is denying that. But in the beginning, there were definitely white slaves. Okay. Under the conditions I have referred to, the gradual transition from white servitude to Negro slavery, which took place during the 17th and 18th centuries, came about naturally and easily. At first, the condition of the Negro slave was in most respects like that of the white servant, except that one was a servant for a fixed period of years and the other was a servant for life. As time went on, however, the two things, black slavery and white servitude, began to grow apart. The condition of the white servant was continually improved, and the condition of the black slave grew steadily worse. The same thing which took place in Virginia took place in other southern colonies. Finally, at the close of the 18th century, Negro slavery had almost entirely replaced white servitude in all the southern counties. Speaking of the causes which brought white servitude to an end in North Carolina, Dr. John Spencer Bassett, formerly professor of history and political science at Trinity College, North Carolina, says the incoming of Negro slaves, who, when the experimental stage was passed, was seen to be cheaper than the white servants, was probably the most powerful of all the causes of the decreased importation of bond servants. The rivalry was between the whites and the blacks. The blacks won. It is impossible not to see in this an analogous process to that by which Negro slavery supplanted Indian slavery in the West Indies. The abuses connected with Indian slavery touched the conscience of the people, and the Negroes who could better stand slavery were introduced to replace it. The abuses connected with white slavery touched the hearts of the British people, and again, the Negro was called in to bear the burden of the necessary labor. In each case, it was a survival of the fittest. Both Indian slavery and white servitude were to go down for the black man's superior endurance, docility, and labor capacity. I have referred at some length to conditions of white servitude in the English colonies before the introduction of the Negro slaves in order to illustrate how easily and naturally the transition was made from slavery in Africa to slavery in America. But I confess these facts have for me another and different interest. It is important that the people of my race should not gain the idea that because they were once in slavery, their situation is wholly exceptional. It is important that we should bear in mind when we are disposed to become discouraged that other races have had to face at some time in their history difficulties quite as great as ours. In America, Negro slavery succeeded white servitude, and it seems probable if the Negro had not been discovered and brought to this country as a laborer, the system of white servitude would have lasted in this country a great deal longer than it actually did. I was interested in noting in what I have read concerning the relations of the races at this early period that the first distinctions made between the black man and the white man were not on the ground of race and color, but on that of religion. That is no doubt characteristic of the time when people were divided by religion rather than by race. The Negroes were heathen, and the law distinguished between those who were Christians and those who were not. For instance, the law declared that no Christian could be made a slave for life. The white bondmen were usually referred to as servants or Christian servants and were in this way distinguished from slaves. The right to enslave a Negro, says Professor Bassett, seems to have been based on the fact that he was a pagan. There was a general notion throughout all Christendom that it was wrong for one Christian to enslave another, and that as soon as a pagan was baptized, he could be no longer held as a slave. This prevented for many years the work of Christianizing the Negroes. So strong was this feeling that it was necessary in several of the colonies to pass laws expressly stating that the condition of the slave was not changed when he was taken into church. On the other hand, as the white servant was a Christian, the principle was gradually established that he could only be held in servitude by Christians or those who were sure to give him Christian usage. Thus, free Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, says Mr. Ballard, although Christians, were incapacitated from holding white servants, as also were infidels such as Jews, Moors, and Mohammedans. Where a white servant was sold to them, or his owner had intermarried with them, the servant became ipso facto free. It is a curious fact that one of the first laws passed discriminating against the Negro because of his race took away from him the right to hold a white man in bondage. Now, I'll stop reading there and just say that that's a good overview of how gradually white slavery came to an end and black slavery, African American slavery, kind of reign supreme. Booker T. Washington, in his works, he goes on to say that the endurance of the African American is what made him sort of the ideal slave. And it was his ability to endure what the white man and the Indian man could not endure, which ultimately sealed his fate to be the primary burden bearer for this new growing and budding nation, right? And so next, I just want to show a few more pieces of primary documentation to go along with my point of white slaves, just to drive the point home. Um, you see here it says the first slaves imported into the American colonies were 100 white children in 1619, 4 months before the arrival of the first shipment of black slaves. Many were brought from Ireland, where the law held that it was no sin to kill an Irishman than a dog or any other brute. Okay. On the bottom it says, and you can read all this on your own time, but on the bottom it says, in the 17th century, from 1600 until 1699, there were many more Irish sold as slaves than Africans. There are records of Irish slaves well into the 18th century. Many never made it off the ships. According to written record, in at least one incident, 132 slaves, men, women, and children, were dumped overboard to drown because ship supplies were running low. They were drowned because the insurance would pay for an accident, but not if the slaves were allowed to starve. Mm, mm, mm. Um, look at this. And this is just going to drive the point home where people want to act like, oh, to be an indentured servant was so much better than being a slave. No, they were slaves, and why the heck did they keep running away? Look at this news article. Uh, Run away from the subscribers the 15th of September something. Two Irish indented servants, one named Maurice Crawley, about 5 feet 8 inches high. And then it goes on to describe him and describe what he has on him. And it's another Irish indentured servant, Jeremiah Harrington. Okay, more runaway slaves. So they're always going to show you the Negro runaway slaves. They're always going to show you that, the wanted posters and the ads in the news. They're always going to tell you about, oh, Harriet Tubman and and black people trying to make it to the north, and African American running from a slave owner and having the dog sicked on them, and the slave catchers after them. But they never tell you that they were running from the slave master too. They never tell you that the dogs were sick on them. They don't tell you this. Maybe not to the extent that the African had to endure. And eventually only the African endured it. But still, the history is there. They were being abused so much as slaves that they were fleeing and running away too, and they were being hunted down too. They were being chased down. Ads were being put out. You see it, family. Two Irish indented servants. Okay. Well, what about this one? This is Hanover Town, May 12th, 1774. Look at that, 1774, right? Just arrived in York River, the brilliant Captain Miller from London with a cargo of choice, healthy, indented servants, the sale of which will begin at Richmond Town on Wednesday, the 25th of May, among whom are the following tradesmen: blacksmiths, braziers, edge tool makers, bricklayers, and planters, shoemakers, stonemasons, carpenters, blah, 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 right? Now, this doesn't necessarily say that they were Irish or anything like that, but it does say that he's coming from London, and it says indented servants. Remember, that's the trigger word for white slave. Indented servant is a white slave. Okay, so they had a fresh cargo, a whole fresh cargo of indented servants coming in, just arriving in the York River in 1774, right? With the white slaves in America. Here's the evidence, right? Look at this one. Look at this one, family. Ran away from the subscriber living in Frederick County on the 15th of April last, an Irish servant named Peter Kelly, but has changed his name to Pierce Byrne and has a pass for that purpose. He is about 5 feet 8 inches high, has dark brown hair and of a dark complexion and down look. And then it goes on to, they always explain what it's just like any wanted thing. They explain what they was last seen wearing, any distinguishing marks. He also, look, he said he ran off with a Negro woman. Also went with him a lusty Negro woman named Rose. Shit, maybe he caught that jungle. He might have caught that jungle fever. Man wanted to marry her, and then they ran off together, fleeing. Trying to get freedom. They escaping to freedom. This Irish guy, this Irish man named Peter Kelly, who changed his name to Pierce Byrne. You feel me? I mean, look at the evidence, family. Here's another piece of evidence. Now, this is harder to see, but you can see at the top, right? It's a man. At the bottom, it's a woman. Both of them white. I'm gonna read what I can. At the top, it says 3 pounds of water. Run away from the subscriber living in Warwick, Furnace, Minnesota, something on the 23rd. An Irish serviceman named Dennis McCallum. Right? There go another Irish serviceman, an Irish slave named Dennis McCallum. Right? If he was just a servant, if everything was all good, what is he running away for? If he agreed to this by contract, what is he running away for? Something ain't right. Something ain't right with the story. You know, something is not all right with the story. This is another Irish man named Dennis McCallum. And on the bottom, runaway, this 5 shillings reward. You get 5 shillings for her if you catch her. Run away from the subscriber living in 4th Street, a little above Ray Street, the 25th something, a girl named Christiania Lower, 23 years of age. Right? But look at that. So women, a white woman enslaved. I don't know what race she is, but she's definitely a white woman. She ran away, right? And slave catches after her. Slave catches after her too. Okay. Look up in the top left corner. Ran away from the subscriber, living at Benedict. on the 2nd of February last, a hired Irish servant man named Patrick Smith, about 5 feet 4 inches high and pretty thick. He had on when he went away a black everlasting waistcoat, a light fustian jacket with white metal buttons, a gray Sagatti coat with blue lining, a pair of blue half-thick breeches, and a cut grizzle wig. Right. So here we got another. Here we got another. The Irish was getting it. Here we got another Irish man, 5 feet 4 inches high, named Patrick Smith. Ran away in February. Okay, ran away in February. Right below that, ran away on the 21st of April from the subscriber living in Borough of Lancaster. An apprentice lad named William Kinley, about 15 years of age, of a fresh complexion and brown hair. Okay. Now, in this one, it doesn't necessarily say what his ethnicity is, but I want you to be mindful. You see how it says an apprentice lad. Remember that contract that I showed you, that first contract for an indentured servant. The man was signing up to be an apprentice. So these are just code words to let you know that they're talking about white people. But for this 15-year-old to run away, something has to be wrong. Don't be fooled. Right? Don't be fooled. Something was happening to this young man. Something was happening to this young man that he did not want to endure. So he ran. Right? They always tell you about the Negro trying to escape, the African American trying to escape, the African American on the run. Why ain't they telling y'all about these white slaves running? Why ain't they telling you about that? Look, let me see. Top right. Ran away on the 13th of April last from the subscriber, living near Blackdenburg in Prince George's County, a servant named Nathaniel Shirley, but may probably change his name. By trade, a carpenter and joiner, a well-fit, clean-limbed man, about 5 feet 10 inches high, of a swarthy complexion. Look, that swarthy complexion is a dead giveaway too. You know, he probably Irish. Has black eyes and a sly look, right? Again, here's a man named Nathaniel Shirley. He ran away on April 13th, right? I don't know exactly what year it is, but I noticed at the bottom right, that's the date of April 24th, 1755. So that's probably when this posted. It's probably all happening in 1755. You got all these Irish slaves right here running. What are they running from? What are they running from, family? There's three more. You know, y'all know. I know y'all never seen this kind of documentation on white slaves in America. You've seen the 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 wanted posters for a runaway. I know it's one real famous runaway slave poster for one only judge that George Washington, this lady that just African American lady that George Washington owned, right? But why don't they show you this? Think about what I'm telling you. Why haven't you seen? Maybe you have. Some of you may have. Y'all are up on y'all studies. But for the most of y'all, why have you not seen all of these white people, these white slaves running away, just like the African American? Okay? Look at this. Look at this. £5 reward. Run away from the subscriber, living at Mr. John Fraser's on Society Hill, Philadelphia, on the 31st of October last. An indented servant man named Daniel Baldridge, born in Scotland and still retains the Scotch accent, about 5 feet 8 inches high, of a swarthy complexion. Look, there was that swarthy complexion again. That indentured servant, swarthy complexion, gives them away. Gives them away. So this man was born in Scotland. So think about it. This was a man born in Scotland, shipped to America as an indentured servant. They probably tripped him up, made him think it was going to be all good, made him think it was going to be all sweet, and he inadvertently became a slave, couldn't deal with it, and went on the run. And I don't know if they ever caught him, but he couldn't deal with it, went on the run. White slaves in America. They do not show you guys this type of history. Again, you see all of the wanted posters of runaway African American slaves, runaway Negro slaves. Why ain't they telling y'all about the white people who was enslaved that was runaways as well? You know, I could go on and on and on. I have a lot of these in the archive, right? Look at this, family. $8 reward. Ran away last night from Cornwall Furnace, Lancaster County, an Irish servant named Herbert Early, something like that, about 23 or 24 years of age, 5 foot 9 or 10 inches high, round shouldered, much pitted with the smallpox, right? So here's another on the run, another runaway slave. And this is another white man, right? I don't even know how many I've shown you guys at this point, but you can go and go and go and go. Now remember, it's just a trigger word when they call them servants, and when they say indentured servant, they're only trying to separate the white people from the black people. But when you look at the conditions that these white slaves were enduring, they endured the same type of hell in Europe. They endured the same type of hell on the boat coming over here, and they endured the same kind of hell when they were on these plantations with their white masters, white slaves, and things was getting so bad that they were running away. They were trying to escape to freedom. Some of them ran with Negroes, some of them ran with African Americans, right? A lot of them. Look, here we go again. I mean, I can do this all day. Ran away on Friday last, the 29th of January, from a gentlewoman in Boston, an Irish servant maid named Mary Farrell, of a middle stature, pretty thick, and somewhat lock broken. She went away with a black riffin gown, an old gray petticoat, and a pair of ticking shoes with red heels. So now think about it. Things are so bad that on January the 29th, right? This Irish lady, this a servant maid, this Irish lady, she went on the run. So if being an indentured servant is so much better than being a Negro slave, like they want to trick us into believing, why are so many, why are so many of these people going on the run, right? Think about it, man. Think about it. Now, like I told you, eventually white slavery went away, and the African American took the sole brunt of slavery in America because the African American was able to endure the climate, was able to endure the hardships, and was able to endure the workload better than the Indian and better than the white. So he was almost a victim of circumstance. But were the whites in America? I've proven that above and beyond. But guess what? Not only were the white slaves trying to run away from the white masters, just like the Negro slaves, I'm gonna show you something else. You always hear about slave revolts, right? And you hear about I'm telling you how this. You always hear about the Nat Turner, right? MRVC. You hear about the Negroes fighting for their freedom from slavery. But did you know that it was white slaves who had their own slave revolts, right? But indentured servants being so much better, right? Check this out, family. Look on the right side first. Gloucester County Conspiracy 1663. Okay, it says the Gloucester County Conspiracy, also known as the Servants' Plot of Birkenhead's Rebellion, was a plan by indentured servants to rise up against authorities in Gloucester County in 1663. 9 men, John Gunter, William Bell, Richard Derbyshire, John Hyatt, Thomas Jones, William Ball, William Pulteney, William Bendel, and Thomas Collins met in the woods and planned an operation whereby they would collect arms and ammunition, and with perhaps as many as 30 recruits, later march on the governor's mansion at Green Spring. There, they would demand that Sir William Berkeley release them from their indentures. A servant man named Birkenhead betrayed them, however, and a number were arrested and four hanged. After rewarding Birkenhead with his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco, the General Assembly declared that the day of their planned insurrection be celebrated annually. So in 1663, you had a rebellion by indentured servants. Remember, indentured servant is only the trigger word. These were white slaves, right? The same white slaves that were running away, just like the Negro slaves, the same white slaves that was being beat, just like the Negro slaves, the same white slaves that was being shipped from Europe, just like the Negro was being shipped from Africa. And these are the same white slaves who was having slave revolts, just like the Negro was having slave revolts. And in case individuals think that this revolt isn't real, they actually have a historic marker on it. If you look to the left, it says the indentured servants plot. The indent means white slave. Indentured servant is a white slave. Remember that. During the summer of 1663, indentured servants held for several years of service in the Paropotonk River in Puritan Bay region, plotted an insurrection against their masters to occur on September 13, 1663. And it just so happened, um, one of them told, one of them told, man. He figured out the plot. He went and told on him, and because he told on him, he won his freedom. Now get this. Remember I told you earlier that some of the white slaves that were over here in America were shipped from Europe. And what they did is they took prisoners in Europe and they sent them to America to be slaves to help build up the colonies. Now, what you're going to find out is the individuals that led this particular revolt, they were prisoners that were sent from Europe to America as slaves, right? And so shortly after this happened, the people in Gloucester County, they basically made a law saying that you could no longer bring criminals, right? No longer bring criminals from Europe that had serious offenses. They didn't want no murderers, no robbers, no rapists, maybe a pickpocket or two. They'll still enslave that one. But the law that they wrote, it read to the effect of the complaints of several of the council, inhabitants of the counties of York, Gloucester, and Middlesex, apprehensions and fears lest the honor of his majesty and the of the colony be too much hazarded and endangered by the great number of felons and other despots sent hither from the several prisons in England, being this day read in council. Wait, stop right there. So you see, they're saying that they are they because of their apprehensions and fears, right, over the great number of felons and desperate individuals that have been sent to the American colonies from the prisons in England. They're showing you that these were prisoners from England that were sent there, right? Now, what are they going to do about it? They say, we have, upon most serious and careful consideration of the same thought, fit to order and do hereby accordingly order that for the prevention and avoiding danger which apparently threatens us from the barbarous designs and felonious practices of such wicked villains, that it shall not be permitted to any person trading hitherto bring in and land any jailbird or such others who for notorious offenses have deserved to die in England from and after the 20th day of January next, upon pain of being forced to keep them on board and carry them to some other country where they may be better secured. And we have been the more induced to make this order by the horror yet remaining amongst us of the barbarous design of such villains in September 1663, who attempted at once the subversion of our religion laws. Okay, so basically what they're admitting to is exactly what I told you earlier. Okay, people love to talk about, oh, on the continent of Africa, Africans were enslaving Africans, right? And Africans were fighting Africans, and Africans were selling Africans to the Europeans to be brought over here to America as slaves. But what they don't tell you, family, what they don't tell you is that in Europe, Europeans were fighting with Europeans, and Europeans were locking Europeans up in prisons, and Europeans were selling Europeans to slave traders to be brought to America as slaves. And it just so happens that some of those prisoners was bought that life. And when they got to Gloucester, they formed a revolt. They planned a revolt, but they got snitched on. And the people were so afraid that they made a law stipulating, wait a minute, you can't send no more serious convicts to our county anymore, right? So it's proven what I told you, that there were indeed white slaves in America, right? And there was indeed white slaves in Europe. They were enslaving each other. They just only tell us about Africans enslaving Africans because it's the controlling of the narrative. You know, that's all that it really is. But when you really look into the history, when you really look into the history, it's a lot of things that's being hidden. You know, it's a lot of things that's being hidden. White people were enslaved in Europe. White people sold white people into slavery, and there was white people enslaved over here that was going through some of the same things that the African was going through. It's just that the white slavery eventually died out, and the African slavery kind of, won the day. We for whatever reason we were more physically capable of maintaining under the workload without falling sick and without dying. So again, somebody may wonder or ask, okay, but why did you make this video? You've been talking to us for over an hour. Why did you make this video? And it goes back to what I said earlier. You know, I'm just going to take another passage that I showed. I'm going to take a passage from the great scholar Booker T. Washington. Okay. Um, he says, I have referred at some length to conditions of white servitude in the English colonies before the introduction of the Negro slaves in order to illustrate how easily and naturally the transition was made from slavery in Africa to slavery in America. But I confess, these facts have for me another and different interest. It is important that the people of my race should not gain the idea that because they were once in slavery, their situation is wholly exceptional. It is important that we should bear in mind when we are disposed to become discouraged that other races have had to face at some time in their history difficulties quite as great as ours. And so the idea is not the African American alone, the Negro alone is not the only people in the world that have ever endured slavery. In fact, slavery goes all the way back to the earliest civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. There was slavery amongst every group of people in every civilized society since the beginning of civilized society and since the beginning of time. There's always been some form of it. So what we have to keep in mind is even though the African American endured slavery right here in America, that is not the end of our story. And just like every other race was able to repair itself after going through slavery, the African American too will come out of this thing on the other side. But the first thing that we kind of have to do is change the perception. See, they want us to only see ourselves as slaves. When people say slave, when people say slavery, when people say enslaved, they want you to automatically see that as yourself, as opposed to a condition that anybody in the world can be placed in. They want to make you feel like you were destined to be a slave. You were created to be a slave. That's all you are, is a slave. And nobody else in the world is a slave but you. And this is the perception that they put us in with the images that they show in the movies that they show in the history that they tell. They don't tell you about them being enslaved. But why do you think that is? Because they know psychologically what that could potentially do to their population. But there were indeed white slaves in America, and that's the hidden history. And I hope that some of the stuff I said was interesting. I hope some of the stuff I said was things you never heard before. You can always go back, watch over the whole video, take time, pause it on some of the slides I showed. Leave a comment in the comment section. Um, like the video, subscribe. So before I log off, as always, for more content like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that little notification bell to be notified whenever I'm going live and to find out whenever I'm dropping a video. If you want to reach out to me, my Facebook is my name, Matthew Daniels. I also have a Facebook group called The Real Bookworm, where I read a lot. And so at various times when I find something interesting, I'll just post that in the group, The Real Bookworm. You can connect with me on there. And I also have a Facebook page called Maze Art. I do sell mazes, and I have written a book. You can find out about that on my social media pages. And I sell the mazes and I sell the book via my Cash App, The Real Bookworm. So just link up with me. Reach out to me, leave a comment. And thanks for watching. Hotel.